All right, so we're in Genesis chapter 41 today. Genesis chapter 41. It's a long chapter, and we're going to look at the whole chapter. This is our 41st message in the book of Genesis. And we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're not quite there, but we can see it. We're moving in that direction. We're excited about God bringing us ultimately to a conclusion in the book of Genesis. There have been so many lessons that we've learned and so many more yet to learn. Today's message, I'm going to break up really into two sections. The first section is a lot lengthier than the second, but the first section is lessons about life. I believe we see in Joseph's story some lessons about life that all of us need to learn. And then next, we'll look at some lessons about God, some things we know about the nature and the character of who God is and the difference He makes in our lives. So let's begin reading in verse 1, chapter 41. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. I've never heard those two words put together, but I kind of like it. Attractive and plump. I may describe myself that way going forward. Remember the history here with Joseph. If you're just joining us today and haven't been a part of the prior messages, Joseph, one of the sons, one of the 12, has been sold into slavery. During that time, he has been purchased as a slave. He's been falsely accused, a crime he did not commit. He's been falsely imprisoned as a result of that false crime. He now finds himself in prison for these 2 years, and it says there, after 2 whole years. So he's been spending this time in prison. He interpreted some dreams while he was in prison that came to be true, because God gave him that interpretation. And now we're about to see an interpretation of a much larger dream. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows. Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed the second time. Behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. And when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted it to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk full and good, 7 ears withered and thin, blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is, as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God. God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." Wow! That morning, he was in prison. That night, he was number 2 in all the land of Egypt. Jewish boy gone to Egypt. Imagine. Only God could do that. What are some life lessons we learn? And then we'll look at the balance of the passage to learn some lessons about God. All of this is about God, but first of all, we see the purpose of life. We see the purpose of life. God has a role for every one of us to fill. He had a role for Joseph, and he was preparing him for it, but he wasn't there yet. Well, he comes to understand that purpose in this meeting with Pharaoh. It gives joy and dignity when you find your purpose. And Joseph found his. Oftentimes we bog down and we think, I don't really like my life. I don't like this aspect of my life. I don't like these things, and I just wish I could have a do-over. But recognize that God may have you where you are because he's preparing you. There is a purpose that God has for you. He's molding you and shaping you. And when you find that purpose and begin to live in that purpose, whether that purpose is for a short season of your life or for an extended period of your life, God wants you in that place. And when you find it, there's joy. There's fulfillment. There is wonder and awe that God would have me in this place. There's a sense of, I guess the word is satisfaction. It doesn't mean that everything is wonderful and fun all the time, but it means that there's a sense of rightness. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be right now. I sense it, and I want to take the steps necessary to stay in that place. So the purpose of life. Secondly, we see the discipline of life, the discipline of life. The most unlikely circumstances are part of our education. Now, if you were to think right now back over your life, and you consider the different meetings, the different paths that have crossed, the different things that have happened in your life over these years, at the time that they were happening, you might not think much of it. But after they have happened, when you look back, you think, I get it now. I understand why that had to happen. I didn't understand it at the time. I remember for me, one of the many stories of my life, it was my last year of seminary, and I had given my resume to a small inner city church with the hope of being considered to be their pastor. I had served on staff at church in many different capacities, different churches, but I had never been sort of the lead pastor of a church, and I really felt like that was what God was calling me to. So I submitted my resume, and I was absolutely amazed that they called, number one, and that they called me to be on as their pastor, number two. I arrived at the church, a very large building. In its day, the church had run over 1,000 people in attendance. The auditorium would seat over 500, much larger than the room you're sitting in right now. And I arrived the first Sunday to preach, and there were 12 people there. And they all sat where they had sat for the last 30 years. There was one over there, there was one down here, there was one back there, there was one over there. And I thought, my goodness, what am I doing here? This is crazy. And so I started getting to know the people, and the church had one deacon. His name was Charlie, sweet man, wonderful man. He had come to know the Lord there in the early 70s and had stayed there. Now he was the only deacon at the church. Charlie pulled me aside one Sunday after church, and he said, Pastor, next Sunday night we're having a church council meeting. So be sure and put that on your calendar. I was like, okay. I thought, what is a church council meeting? I don't even know what it is. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'll just go. I talked to a couple of my seminary professors, and they kind of gave me an understanding of what a church council was. I was like, all right. Basically, it's like a leadership team for a church. So the next Sunday evening, I showed up at the church council meeting, which was in the boardroom at the church, big board table, long. I sat down at the table, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do. It was their meeting, right? They just wanted me to be there. I figured I would pray to begin and pray to end. That was kind of the pastor's role, I thought. So I got in there, and sure enough, they asked me if I would pray. I said it would be my honor. I prayed, and then they started having this very awkward meeting. And there were 7 people at the meeting, so 7 of the 12 were actually on the church council, So as things were unfolding, I sat and listened, and I noticed that Charlie, the deacon, he kind of gave leadership to the meeting. After the meeting was over, it was time for our Sunday evening worship service, so I was making my way down the sidewalk to the auditorium, and Charlie pulled me aside. He put his arm around me, and he said, now, Pastor, next month at our church council meeting, you'll need to lead it. And I went, oh. It hit me. He expected me to lead the meeting. That's why it was so awkward. I didn't know how to do that. So during the next month, I did a lot of education on how do you lead a church council meeting. I talked to a lot of pastors. I talked to a lot of other people and got a better understanding. This is part of the discipline that God takes us through in every area of our lives. And all of you have stories like that where you sort of learn the hard way about how to do something, how to give leadership. All of us that are parents have stories like that about our parenting. All of us have learned the hard way on how to parent and sometimes how not to parent in different situations. So the purpose of life, the discipline of life. Next, we see the duty of life in Joseph. The duty of life. I mean, he just seemed to keep taking the next step and putting the next foot in front of the last foot. And there were a lot of challenges that came to his life, but he seemed not to be deterred. He just kind of kept moving forward. And even in the midst of these dreams, both in prison and now with Pharaoh that he is interpreting, he first and foremost gives honor to God. It's kind of his duty to just move forward, but he never moves away from that sense of the connection to God. He showed patience and loyalty and faithfulness, and he perfectly fulfilled his duties. And he just seemed to keep at it. And again, God began to open these doors for him that would not have opened if he had not kept moving. He didn't seem to have any bitterness. He didn't seem to have any anger in his heart. He just kept moving forward. And these duties are what we sometimes call chores. They're not always fun, but it's part of the life plan that God has for us as we move forward in faith. Fourth, we see the assurance of life, the assurance of life. The secret of Joseph's loyalty was his awareness that God was with him and was working in his behalf. He seems to constantly have that awareness. Now, maybe there's some details left out. Maybe there's some things about Joseph's life that we don't see in the unfolding story of God's grace here. But we certainly do see aspects of his awareness of God and his understanding that God had him. God was moving him forward and carrying him. And in part, like I've already stated, we see that in how he gave honor to God, even in the interpretation of dreams. Saying, I don't interpret dreams. I don't know anything. I'm not one of your magicians. God interprets dreams. So let me beseech God. Let me go to God and see if God has an interpretation, and I'll give that to you, and that's how it comes to be. And oftentimes, in this assurance of life, in this duty of life, as we just put one foot in front of the other, in front of the other, in front of the other, it can become very laborious. And we can oftentimes feel like we're stuck. What do you have for me, God? It seems like I'm just in a holding pattern. Isaiah speaks to that in his writings in Isaiah chapter 64. If you're taking notes, it's Isaiah 64 verses 1 through 4. Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at your presence, as when fire kindles brushwood and the fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, that the nations might tremble at your presence. When you did awesome things that we did not look for, you came down, the mountains quaked at your presence. From of old, no one has heard or perceived by the ear. No eye has seen a God besides you who acts for those who, what? Wait for him. God acts for those who wait for him. And that's what we see in Joseph's life. We see this waiting. But he has an assurance that God is there, but he's waiting. He's been in prison for 2 years. He's been waiting. It's as if God cannot move. But then God moves powerfully. What a great lesson for us to learn, that we can wait on the holiness and the righteousness and the grace of God. He does not forget us. He has a plan for us. And then last, we see the glory of life. The glory of life. Joseph exemplified this in his constant living for others. He gave himself to serve others. We see that over and over again in this story. And when you give yourself that way, the Bible teaches, the story of Joseph teaches us, Christ ultimately taught it perfectly when he gave himself for us on the cross. When we give ourselves for others, we gain true influence. And here's the struggle, and we struggle against this in our culture. Ambition is the antithesis of service. Our nature, our natural bent, is that we have an ambition, a pridefulness that says, I want to be in this position. And you color that box in however you see it. We even applaud that in others. Those who go for the ring get it. We have that sort of go for it in sports, in life, in business, in relationships, all that. We have this, I'm going to go for it, and I'm going to get what I want. But the Bible teaches the opposite of that. I'm going to help others get what they need. I'm going to help others in their quest for purpose in life. And in so doing, you become this incredible person of influence, though it seems like you wouldn't be. You become the one that people go to and ask for counsel. You become the one that people go to and say, would you pray for me? Because I just feel like your prayers matter more. And so the glory of life. True influence comes when we serve others. All right, I want to read on because it's not the end of the story. Verse 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I've set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand, and he put it in Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zebanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, where he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. Some lessons about God in this story. First, we see the providence of God. Joseph's life has many links in the chain, many turns and twists and crossing of paths of people. And life is filled with those little things, those little connections, those little meetings. At the time, they don't seem that significant. But later, you back up and you go, that was a significant meeting. That was a significant thing that happened. That was important that I met that person at that time. Last September, We were visiting, Laura and I were visiting in Annapolis. Our son Max is with us today. We're so glad our family's together. He's a student at the Naval Academy. And he's one of those midshipmen that's a part of the ministry that Lucy and Eric are going to be serving in. And Justin, who is the director of that ministry, they were hosting a cookout. I think I was making my way across the room for a second hamburger, if I'm not mistaken. And Justin pulled me aside and he said, "Hey, you're a pastor. Our ministry's growing and we need people. We need more staff because I can't adequately meet the needs of all the midshipmen. So if you know of anyone, if you cross paths with anyone, if anyone comes to mind, just let me know." And I said, "I know a guy." He said, "You do?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Who?" I said, "My future son-in-law." He said, "No way. Tell me about him." And so that began Eric and Justin talking on the phone, Eric and Lucy feeling called of God to go. I'm so glad I was going to get a second hamburger. Now, it appears to me a chance meeting, but not by God. God knew that conversation was going to happen before the founding of time. He knows that in your lives as well. He knows the situations of your lives. He knows what's taking place. And so what do we see in that? We see the providence of God. Number one, the providence of God. Never underestimate God's hand in it all. Every aspect of your life is God's sovereign leadership and oversight and detail. He cares. It matters. He loves you. He has a plan. And He is providentially giving that plan as you trust and obey and follow Him. But also we see in Joseph's story, we see the righteousness of God. The righteousness of God. As we rest in God and wait patiently, we will see His righteousness. It doesn't always feel that way. You know, we look around and we see a lot of unrighteousness and we think, where's God? How could God allow this to happen or that to happen, or I don't understand, or what's going on here? Sometimes those are issues in our own lives. Sometimes it's just because we turn the news on and we wonder what is happening. The righteousness of God will not be deterred. It may appear that it is not there, but over time, and especially for all of eternity, we will come to understand the righteousness of God. God will finish what He begins. And understanding that and trusting in that causes us to live differently in the midst of the struggle, whatever it may be. And it causes us to know that we can put one more foot out, one more foot out, one more foot out, and keep moving forward. Third, we see the wisdom of God. We see the wisdom of God. Our best work is always the result of long preparation. The process of training is long, but the power that results is great. God knows what He is doing. And to some extent, we never stop learning, growing, training for what God has for us this side of heaven. So the wisdom of God. I would much rather have the wisdom of God than the authority of man. I would much rather have the wisdom that God gives to His people and the grace that God gives to His people than I can have in my own strength and my own power. And then last, we see that great picture of the grace of God, the grace of God. We see the grace of God at every stage of Joseph's life as he continues forward in God's plan. There's no school like God's grace. Now, once we have this grace of God, it transforms how we live. We're no longer the same. There is a joy, even in the midst of struggle and pain. I remember as a little boy going to church every time the doors were open. That's what our family did. My parents were not in vocational ministry, but it was not an option at the Bevel household. We went to church. I didn't always want to go to church. And I remember even as a little guy, as I became a teenager, there were certainly many times I didn't want to go to church. But as a younger guy, there were a lot of times I didn't want to go to church. And I remember we always parked in the same place. My parents were creatures of habit. We always parked in the same parking spot, or close to it. We always walked in the same door. I went to a very large church. We always walked in the same door. And we always sat in the same place. Some of you do that too. And some of you confuse me when I'm preaching because you'll be sitting over here when you're supposed to be over here. Not supposed to, but you know, it confuses me. And so every Sunday, almost without fail, Mr. Russo would greet us at that door. He was the greeter. at that door. I remember him like it was yesterday. And Mr. Russo had two things that little boys loved. He always had to shake your hand, and he would always say, "Shake it firmly, young man." Always, every single Sunday, for years. "Good morning, Mr. Russo." "Yes, sir, shake it firmly." Do that. He would talk with my parents for a moment, and then he would say, "Are you ready?" I would say, "Yes, sir." And he would reach into his pocket, and he would pull out his pocket knife. He always had a pocket knife, but every single Sunday, for 52 weeks, it would be a different pocket knife. He collected pocket knives. It was the coolest thing I had ever seen. And I know now, they were expensive pocket knives. They were made out of bone and all kinds of interesting. I think I carry a pocket knife now. I carry the same cheap one all the time. But I think I carry a pocket knife now in part because of Mr. Russo. He always had a pocket knife. And he would show me the knife. And as I got a little bit older, he would let me open the knife. I mean, it was a big deal. I would just stand there some weeks and wait until he handed me the pocket knife. The second thing he always had in his pocket was some kind of candy or gum. I think he had unlimited pockets. He didn't look like he was that stuffed, but I know every kid, boy or girl, that came through got a piece of candy. And every week as I went to church, I would oftentimes get out of the car. I know your kids probably don't ever huff. I was a huffer. And I would huff walking across the parking lot because I didn't want to be there. And there's Mr. Russo, and I would remember, I'm about to get sugar. He has sugar in his pocket for me. And he would hand me that. And why do I share that simple story? This man influenced me without ever saying a word. So much so that 40 years later, I'm telling you the story as if it happened yesterday. He influenced me. The joy on his face. He always was dressed so sharply. I remember that about him too. He was so put together. And I said to my parents as I got older, as I was an older teenager, I said, how old is Mr. Russo? Because I realized as I got older, he's old. And they said, "Eddie, the first time you ever met him, he was 80. I would have never guessed that when I was 10. I would have guessed that he was not 80. I don't know how old I would have thought he was. I mean, little kids don't always know how old people are. But what he had was he had the joy of the Lord. And he never quit putting one foot in front of the other. He was not a great Bible teacher. He was not someone that I knew because of his ability to lead in the ministry of the church. But he had significant influence over a large portion of the church where I grew up. And he's still having that influence. I think about him occasionally when I'm greeting someone, when I'm talking to a child, when I'm hearing about a challenge or a struggle in someone's life, and I remember the joy of the Lord on his face. And I remember the pep in his step, the way he carried himself. And I know now that was all because of his relationship with Jesus. So, life gives us many lessons to learn. And God has interjected himself in the course of history so that we might come to know him. So whatever you do for a living, whatever the dynamics of your family, whatever the challenges of your life or the joys of your life, just know that God has a plan that is probably bigger than what you think. Will you trust him to take the next step in that journey of faith? Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this unfolding story of Joseph. I thank you for how he embodies in a real sense what it means to just simply trust. He certainly did not have it easy. Imprisoned, falsely accused, sold into slavery, so many challenges, Lord. But yet, you had a plan. You had an incredible plan for his life, and that plan was unfolding. And as it came to fruition in him, we see that you were preparing him all along the way. Well, you're doing the same thing for us. You're preparing us. You want to use us in new and exciting ways to make a difference in people's lives. So, Lord, first I want to pray for those in the room who do not yet know you. I pray, God, that you would open their hearts to the truth about you, that they would come to know your grace, the gift of life that you provide. Lord, I pray, too, for those here today, many of us in the room who do know you, and yet there's a struggle before us. There's a decision before us. There's a challenge before our eyes, and we need your wisdom. We need your leadership. We need your grace. We need you to grow us more into the people that you've called us to be. And so I ask that you would do that. It could have to do with any area of our life, our parenting, our marriage, our work, our personal struggles. Maybe there is a depression. Maybe there is a doubt or a fear. It could be financial. It could be related to our health. It could be any number of things, Lord. But you can use that seemingly difficult situation to mold and shape us into the people that you can use for your glory and your honor. And so I ask, God, that you would do so. Now, as we enter into this time of decision, I pray that you would move in our midst in a powerful way. And I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. As we sing together in just a moment, I want to invite you, if there is a pressing decision before you, if you need God's wisdom in some unique way right now, maybe there's a challenge in your life and it's really causing great struggle in your heart, in your mind, I think it's right for you to step out from your seat and to come forward and kneel and just ask God to give you what is needed, whatever it may be, His provision, His wisdom, His interjection in your life, whatever it may be, His healing. It could be for you, it could be for someone else in your life, but just ask God to do what only God can do. He does His best work in the most difficult circumstances. He's got a good plan for you. And so as we sing, I encourage you to do that. And also, I'll be standing here. If you'd like to know what it means to begin this relationship with God through His Son, Jesus, it would be my great joy to talk with you more about the details of that. So would you stand? And you come now as God leads.
Unravel me with a melody. You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Love has called my name. I've been born again into a family. Your blood flows through my veins. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. Oh, 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 oh. child of God.
There's a reason for that. Therefore, as you receive Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in what? Thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. You've been filled in him, who is the head of all rule and authority. In him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. We serve a crucified, risen, and coming again Savior. We can live with great victory as a result of that, no matter the challenges that life brings at us. Go and live in the joy and the wonder of God. God bless you.